What if I told you that medieval people weren't just paranoid conspiracy theorists muttering about secret plots in dark taverns? Here is a fact that will blow your mind. According to documented court records and Inquisition transcripts from the 12th through 15th centuries, many of the wild conspiracy theories, whispered by terrified peasants and dismissed by authorities as pure fantasy, were actually happening. We're talking secret monk assassins, underground pagan networks, hidden treasure vaults filled with banned books, and poisoning plots so elaborate they'd make modern political thrillers look like children's bedtime stories. If that just made you think, wait, medieval people were right about the conspiracies, then you're absolutely going to love what's coming next, because tonight we're diving into the conspiracy theories that medieval Europe laughed at until they turned out to be disturbingly, scandalously, historically true. Hey friends, tonight we'll walk right through the heart of medieval Europe's darkest whispers, the conspiracy theories that weren't theories at all. Before you get comfortable, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Medieval Europe ran on two currencies, gold and paranoia. Every village had its whispers. Every castle had its secrets, and tucked between the prayers and the plagues were conspiracy theories so wild, so theatrical, that even the people spreading them half expected to be laughed out of the tavern. Except here's the thing, some of those tavern whispers were absolutely, undeniably, documentably correct. Let's start peeling back the layers. Medieval conspiracy theories that turned out to be true. Let's talk about royal dinner tables, because if you thought modern food safety regulations were strict, medieval kings took it to an entirely different level, and they had good reason. The conspiracy theory went like this. Every meal served to a king was a potential assassination attempt. Nobles were supposedly hiring poisoners, infiltrating kitchens, and turning royal banquets into elaborate murder plots disguised as hospitality. Sounds dramatic, right? Like something out of a Netflix series with too much budget and not enough historical accuracy. Except according to chronicles from England, France, and the Byzantine Empire, this wasn't paranoia. This was Tuesday. Picture this. You're a medieval king. You wake up in your cold stone castle, adjust your crown, and immediately face the day's most dangerous activity, breakfast. The royal kitchen isn't some cozy place with celebrity chefs tasting sauces. It's a battlefield where every pot represents a different way to die. The head cook could be loyal, could be bribed, could have a cousin who really wants your throne. That charming servant who's been with your family for years, maybe genuine, maybe waiting for the right price. Even the dog that licks your hand might have been fed something to make it friendlier to strangers. So kings invented a solution that was both brilliant and absolutely grim, the royal taster. This was a real job title, official position, came with room and board and the occasional bonus of not dying. The taster's responsibilities were simple. Eat everything the king plans to eat. Then sit there for about 20 minutes while everyone watches to see if you start sweating, convulsing, or politely excusing yourself to vomit behind the tapestries. Here's where it gets interesting. This wasn't just ceremonial theater. According to medieval court records, tasters actually died. Multiple documented cases across Europe show tasters collapsing, foaming at the mouth, or mysteriously falling ill right after sampling the king's roasted pheasant. which meant the system worked if your definition of worked includes someone died, but at least it wasn't the king. Now, you might think this sounds paranoid. Surely most meals were perfectly safe, right? Well, let's look at the evidence. King John of England, famous for losing the crown jewels in a swamp because apparently he couldn't handle basic logistics, was widely suspected by contemporary chroniclers of poisoning at least one political rival. One that we know about. The man was petty enough to hold grudges against monks who criticized his table manners, so slipping something into a competitor's wine? Totally plausible. In fact, some historians suggest John's own death in 1216 might have involved poisoning, which would be medieval karma at its finest. But here's the kicker. England was actually mild compared to the Byzantine Empire. If medieval poisoning was a sport, Byzantium was the Olympics. According to Byzantine court histories, emperors died suspiciously so often that natural causes became palace code for, we're not saying it was poison, but it was definitely poison. Courtiers traded toxins like baseball cards. One chronicler recorded that certain noble families kept personal poison makers on staff, the medieval equivalent of having a guy. The church, predictably, condemned all of this. Poisoning was declared sinful, cowardly, and distinctly unchristian, which didn't stop bishops from occasionally hiring their own tasters when visiting rivals, because even holy men understood that faith is great, but not dying is better. And yet, beneath all the theatrics, the conspiracy was real. Kitchens were infiltrated, servants were bribed, meals were weaponized. Some plots failed because the poison was too weak, or the taster survived, or the target got suspicious and dramatically knocked the goblet across the room in front of horrified dinner guests. But some succeeded. We'll never know how many, because medieval coroners weren't exactly equipped with toxicology labs. He died suddenly was the official report, and everyone moved on while quietly wondering whose cousin benefited most from the inheritance. The point is, medieval kings weren't being over-dramatic when they treated every meal like a potential crime scene. They were being realistic. In a world where betrayal was currency and succession wars killed thousands, a pinch of arsenic in the morning porridge was just efficient politics. So yes, the conspiracy theory about royal poisoning? Completely, thoroughly, disturbingly true. Every banquet was a gamble. Every kitchen was a risk. And every bite the king took was a small victory against the people who wanted him dead. But that was just the beginning. Let's talk about the forest, because if medieval villagers had a list of things that terrified them, right after plague and taxes came, whatever is happening in those trees after sunset, the conspiracy theories spread like wildfire. Secret pagan cults were hiding in the woods, conducting forbidden rituals under the full moon, worshipping old gods the church had supposedly eradicated centuries ago, and probably doing it all barefoot, because medieval conspiracy theorists had very specific imaginations. The church took this seriously, very seriously. According to Inquisition records and episcopal decrees from across Europe, bishops launched investigations, priests organized search parties, and local authorities offered rewards for information about these shadowy forest gatherings. The official line was clear. Paganism was dead, Christianity had won, and anyone claiming otherwise was spreading dangerous rumors that undermined holy authority. Except here, the twist that nobody wanted to admit, the villagers were right. Now, before you imagine elaborate temples hidden behind oak trees with dozens of hooded figures chanting in perfect harmony, let's get realistic. These weren't massive, organized cults with membership cards and annual conferences. They were small, desperate groups of people, mostly peasants, trying to hold on to traditions older than the stone churches that had replaced their sacred groves. According to trial records from the Benandante in northern Italy, documented extensively by historian Carlo Ginzburg, there really were people who gathered in secret to perform rituals the church had banned. The Benandanti claimed they left their bodies at night to fight evil spirits and protect crops from witches. Did they actually believe this? Absolutely. Did the church believe this? Also, yes, which is why they arrested them for heresy instead of dismissing it as harmless role play. But it wasn't just Italy. Across medieval Europe, from the forests of Germany to the hills of Scotland, inquisitors kept stumbling onto the same pattern. Hidden gatherings, old songs sung in languages that predated Latin, offerings left at ancient stone circles, and locals who insisted these rituals were necessary to ensure good harvests, healthy livestock, and protection from evil. The most common practitioners were the so-called wise women, though calling them that makes them sound mystical, when really they were just the medieval equivalent of unlicensed therapists with a side hustle in herbal medicine. These women knew plants, knew healing, and knew which old prayers to mutter over a sick cow. When the local priest's blessings didn't work, and your sheep kept dying, you went to the woman who lived at the forest edge and didn't ask too many questions about her methods. Here's where the conspiracy gets darker. The church knew these practices existed. Episcopal records show bishops writing frustrated letters to each other, complaining that villagers kept visiting forbidden places, despite repeated warnings. Some priests tried to compromise, quietly allowing harvest festivals that were definitely pagan in origin but had been given Christian names. Others took a harder line, organizing raids into the forests to destroy stone circles and arrest anyone caught with suspicious herbs. And the villagers? They kept their mouths shut, attended church on Sunday, nodded at the sermons about pagan sin, and then quietly continued going to the forest when they needed real help. Because in medieval Europe, survival trumped theology every single time. The most fascinating part is how these groups communicated. According to testimonies from various trials, they used symbols scratched into tree bark, specific patterns of tied grass, or particular stones left at crossroads. It was a coded network that wouldn't have looked out of place in a spy novel, except it was real people risking torture and execution just to remember how their great-grandparents prayed. Of course, the church's response was to assume these gatherings were demonic. If people were meeting in secret, they must be worshiping Satan, which is medieval logic at its finest. We don't understand what they're doing, so clearly it's the worst possible thing. This led to interrogations, where terrified peasants were asked whether they'd seen the devil, kissed a demon, or pledged their souls to darkness, when in reality they'd just been singing old songs and leaving bread offerings at a tree. So yes, the conspiracy was true. Medieval Europe did have secret pagan cults hiding in the forests. They weren't evil. They weren't plotting to overthrow Christianity. They were just groups of people trying to survive in a world that had outlawed their ancestors' beliefs. They gathered quietly, practiced carefully, and hoped nobody asked too many questions. But of course, somebody always did. Now let's talk about monks, because if you thought they spent all their time copying manuscripts and baking bread and peaceful contemplation, I'm about to ruin that image forever. The conspiracy theory whispered in taverns and noble courts across Europe went like this. Some monasteries weren't just houses of prayer. They were training grounds for assassins, holy men who could kill as efficiently as they could pray, moving through kingdoms with religious immunity while carrying out political murders for wealthy patrons. Sounds like a rejected video game plot, right? Except according to fragmentary chronicles, trial records, and very nervous letters between bishops, this wasn't fiction. It was policy. Here's how it worked. Medieval monasteries welcomed all kinds of people. Genuine believers seeking salvation, second sons with no inheritance, criminals seeking sanctuary, and occasionally men with very specific skill sets who needed a cover story. Joining a monastery gave you a monk's robe, which was basically a medieval all-access pass. You could travel between kingdoms without suspicion. You could enter noble courts because holy men were welcome everywhere. And if you happened to have a side job involving sharp objects and unfortunate accidents, well, nobody was going to interrogate a man of God too closely. The most convincing evidence comes from something historians call lay brothers, members of monasteries who performed manual labor rather than scholarly work. These men took vows, lived in the monastery, but weren't ordained priests. They were strong, often came from military backgrounds, and according to some records, traveled frequently on monastery business that was never quite explained in detail. Contemporary chronicles drop hints everywhere. A noble dies mysteriously, and suddenly there's a reference to a brother from the monastery who had visited him days earlier. A political rival falls from a tower, and local records mention monks seen in the area who disappeared immediately after. A stubborn landowner who refused to donate property to the church suddenly repents and signs everything over before dying under suspicious circumstances, and witnesses recall a traveling monk offering him spiritual counsel. Now, the church would never admit this officially. That would be terrible PR. But medieval bishops weren't stupid. They knew their monasteries housed all kinds of men, and they knew that wealthy nobles sometimes made extremely generous donations with very specific requests attached. We need prayers for our family's souls, and also that merchant who testified against us in court. Maybe prayers for him too, very intense prayers, near a cliff. According to trial records from a 14th century inquiry in England, one monk was actually caught carrying weapons, disguises, and coded letters. When interrogated, he claimed he was protecting holy relics during transport. The fact that these relics included 3 different knives, rope, and a vial of something the investigators absolutely did not test because they preferred plausible deniability, well, that raised questions nobody officially asked. Here's the really wild part. Kingdoms tolerated this. Why? Because monasteries solved problems efficiently and quietly. Need a political rival removed without starting a war? A mysterious monastic visitor was cheaper than hiring an army. Want to eliminate someone but maintain divine favor? Having a holy man do it felt less sinful than sending a common thug, which is medieval mental gymnastics at Olympic levels. Some monasteries even developed reputations. Certain orders were known for housing men with troubled pasts, which was code for they know how to handle violence and we don't ask questions. Nobles would specifically request prayers from these particular monasteries, and everyone understood what that meant. Of course, most monks were genuinely peaceful. The vast majority spent their lives in legitimate prayer, study, and labor. But enough evidence exists to suggest that hidden among them were specialists, men who could chant matins at dawn, and ensure a political problem disappeared by sunset. So yes, the conspiracy about monastic assassins was real. Not every monastery, not even most monasteries, but enough that medieval Europe's power brokers knew if you needed something done quietly and you wanted God on your side while doing it, you didn't hire a salesword. You made a generous donation to the right monastery and waited for a traveling brother to handle things. The church never officially acknowledged this naturally. That would undermine the whole peace and love message. But the evidence speaks for itself. Behind the incense and the manuscripts, some monasteries housed men who could kill as skillfully as they prayed. And medieval Europe pretended not to notice because some secrets were too useful to expose. All right, here's where things get interesting because we need to talk about the Knights Templar. If you asked a medieval European what these warrior monks were up to, you'd get wild theories. Secret treasure hoards, mysterious rituals, demonic worship, controlling kings through financial blackmail, and possibly inventing banking, which to medieval minds was basically the same as summoning demons. The fascinating part? Strip away the demonic stuff and most of it was true. Let's start with the basics. The Templars began as a small group of knights protecting Christian pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem. Noble cause, heroic mission, very inspirational. But then they made a critical mistake. They got really, really good at their job. Within decades, they transformed from 9 knights with a dream into the most powerful military financial organization in Europe. They owned castles, commanded armies, operated fleets, and controlled more wealth than most kingdoms. According to financial records from the 13th century, the Templars invented international banking. Seriously, a pilgrim in London could deposit gold with the Templars, receive a coded letter, travel to Jerusalem, and withdraw the same amount minus a small fee. No risk of highway robbery, no heavy coins to carry, just medieval cryptocurrency backed by men in white cloaks with red crosses and very sharp swords. This system made them phenomenally wealthy. Kings borrowed from them. Popes borrowed from them. Entire crusades were financed through Templar credit, which meant they held debts from the most powerful people in Europe. And here's a fun fact about medieval politics. Nobody likes their creditor, especially when that creditor also has better soldiers than you do. Now let's talk about the secret rituals, because this is where the conspiracy theory really took off. The Templars conducted initiation ceremonies in private. Nobody outside the order witnessed them. No documentation explained what happened. Naturally, medieval Europe assumed the absolute worst. The rumors started small. They're worshiping a mysterious head. They're denying Christ. They're spitting on crosses. They're engaging in unholy acts during midnight ceremonies. Were any of these true? According to historians who've studied the actual evidence, probably not. The Templars were warrior monks with strict religious vows and military discipline. Their secret rituals likely involved oaths, confessions, and organizational rules, boring administrative stuff that needed privacy. But here's the thing, the secrecy itself was real. The Templars absolutely refused to let outsiders witness their ceremonies. They kept coded records. They operated secure communication networks across Europe and the Holy Land. They maintained financial secrecy that would make modern Swiss banks jealous. So while they probably weren't worshiping severed heads named Baphomet, they definitely were hiding something, mainly their financial operations, which in medieval times felt equally demonic. Then came King Philip IV of France, a man with expensive tastes, empty coffers, and a spectacular talent for blaming other people for his problems. Philip owed the Templars enormous sums of money. Rather than pay them back, he decided to accuse them of heresy, arrest them all, torture them into confessions, and seize their assets. It's the medieval equivalent of declaring bankruptcy by burning down the bank and arresting the bankers. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, Philip's forces arrested Templars across France in a coordinated dawn raid. The inquisitors went to work with enthusiasm and torture devices. Under extreme duress, some Templars confessed to worshiping demons, denying Christ, and various acts that conveniently justified Philip's seizure of their property. Modern historians agree that these confessions were extracted through methods that made waterboarding look gentle. But here's the twist. Even without the demonic nonsense, the Templars really were guilty of the things that made them dangerous. Holding massive wealth, operating a secret financial empire, keeping privileged information from authorities, and wielding power that rivaled kingdoms. They weren't evil, but they were absolutely a threat to kings who wanted absolute control. The treasure rumors? Partially true. The Templars did hold enormous wealth, though most of it was in property, loans, and financial instruments, rather than piles of gold coins in secret vaults. When Philip arrested them, he expected to find rooms full of treasure. Instead, he found mostly ledgers, which were somehow more threatening because they proved how deeply the Templars had embedded themselves into Europe's economy. After the trials, torture, and executions, the Templar order was dissolved. Their property was seized, their members scattered, and their reputation destroyed. But the conspiracy theories never died, because enough truth existed beneath the lies. The Templars really did control massive wealth. They really did operate in secrecy. They really did run an international network that kings couldn't fully monitor. So yes, the conspiracy theories about the Knights Templar were largely true, just not in the way medieval minds imagined. They weren't worshipping demons or summoning dark powers. They were doing something far more revolutionary and dangerous. They were creating the foundations of international banking, maintaining financial independence from royal authority, and proving that military orders could accumulate power that rivaled kingdoms. Medieval Europe was right to be nervous about them, just not for the reasons they thought. Now let's talk about the Black Death, because when it arrived in 1347, people naturally needed answers. What caused this horror? Why was it spreading so fast? And most importantly, did anyone know this was coming before the rest of us started dying? The conspiracy theory emerged almost immediately. The Church, with its network of monasteries, pilgrim routes, and international correspondence, knew about the plague before ordinary people did. Bishops were supposedly reading reports from the East, tracking its movement through trade routes, and quietly preparing, while peasants remained ignorant until the bodies started piling up in their villages. Here's the uncomfortable truth. They weren't entirely wrong. According to surviving letters between church officials, bishops, and monastic networks, information about the plague did flow through ecclesiastical channels before it reached public knowledge. Phoenician merchants wrote to monasteries about devastation in eastern ports. Papal envoys sent reports from Black Sea colonies describing entire towns emptied. Italian bishops received warnings from their counterparts about pestilence sweeping through Constantinople months before it hit Sicily. The Church had access to something peasants didn't: long-distance communication networks. While a village farmer's information radius ended at the nearest market town, church officials exchanged letters across continents. They knew when trade ships brought more than spices, they brought death. They knew which ports to avoid before local populations understood the danger. And what did they do with this information? According to records, some bishops closed monastery gates weeks before the plague arrived in their regions. Some quietly relocated to countryside estates with better air, cleaner water, and far fewer people. Some issued vague warnings about corruption in the air, without explaining why, leading to confusion rather than preparation. Medieval chronicler Henry Knighton recorded that certain monasteries locked themselves down before the plague visibly reached their areas, suggesting they'd received a warning. Contemporary sources mention bishops issuing quarantine orders, restricting entry to cities, and closing gates before outbreaks became obvious, meaning someone, somewhere, knew something. But here's where it gets ethically murky. The church didn't share specific information with the general population. No public announcements about incoming ships from infected ports. No detailed warnings about avoiding crowded markets. Just vague spiritual advice. Pray more, repent for your sins, avoid excessive joy, which apparently God considered a plague risk. Why the silence? Several reasons, all of them pragmatic and none of them reassuring. First, church authorities didn't want to cause panic. Medieval crowns panicked easily and violently, and panic killed social order faster than the plague killed people. Second, they didn't fully understand the disease themselves. They knew it spread, they knew it killed, but they couldn't explain it beyond bad air and divine punishment. Third, and this is the darkest part, maintaining information control protected the church's authority. If bishops admitted they couldn't stop the plague despite warnings, it undermined their spiritual legitimacy. Better to frame it as mysterious divine will than admit they saw it coming and couldn't do anything about it. Meanwhile, the official advice given to peasants was spectacularly unhelpful. Burn aromatic herbs, which did nothing. Avoid sinful thoughts, which plague absolutely didn't care about. Balance your humors through bloodletting, which actually made people weaker and more likely to die. Don't experience excessive happiness, because medieval medicine truly believed joy made you vulnerable to disease. Some bishops went further, claiming the plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins, which is a convenient explanation when you can't provide a medical one. This narrative shifted blame onto the victims while simultaneously reinforcing church authority. Only through prayer, penance, and generous donations to the church could salvation be found. Merchant records tell a more revealing story. Venetian traders noted in letters that they received warnings from church officials to avoid certain ports a week before the plague erupted there visibly. This wasn't prophecy. It was insider information circulating through ecclesiastical networks while ordinary merchants remained oblivious until their crew started dying. The conspiracy theory wasn't about the church causing the plague. That was impossible and absurd. It was about withholding timely information that could have saved lives. Could medieval authorities have organized better quarantines, port closures, or travel restrictions if information had been shared widely? Maybe. Would it have stopped the plague completely? No. The medieval world lacked the medical knowledge and infrastructure for that. But the selective distribution of information reveals something crucial about medieval power structures. Knowledge was currency, and those who controlled it had advantages the common people didn't. A bishop who knew plague was coming could stock supplies, close gates, and prepare. A peasant who knew nothing would keep working until the sickness arrived and wiped out his family. So yes, the conspiracy theory was essentially true. The church and other authorities knew more about the plague's spread than they publicly admitted. They used that knowledge to protect themselves and their institutions first, leaving ordinary people to face the horror with minimal warning and terrible advice about avoiding joy. Did they intentionally hide information with malicious intent? Probably not. Did they prioritize their own survival and institutional preservation over public transparency? Absolutely. And that gap between what authorities knew and what they shared became one more quiet betrayal in a pandemic that killed roughly 1/3 of Europe's population. The peasants weren't wrong to whisper that someone knew more than they were saying. They just couldn't prove it until historians started reading those carefully preserved letters centuries later. Let's talk about something that sounds too bizarre to be real, but absolutely was. Secret networks of Jewish and Muslim communities operating across medieval Europe, coordinating movements, sharing information, and helping each other survive in a world that wanted them dead. Christians at the time called it a conspiracy, a shadowy alliance plotting against Christendom. The wild part? The networks existed, just not for the sinister reasons Christians imagined. Here's the context. Medieval Europe wasn't exactly welcoming to religious minorities. Jews and Muslims faced constant threats, forced conversions, pogroms, expulsions, property seizures, and periodic accusations of everything from poisoning wells to stealing communion wafers to make bread, which, yes, was an actual medieval accusation because paranoia had no limits. So these communities did what any rational group would do when surrounded by hostility. They organized. According to research by historians like Mark Cohen and David Nirenberg, Jewish communities across Europe maintained informal networks of safe houses, messenger routes, and mutual aid systems. It wasn't a centralized conspiracy. It was a survival mechanism built from necessity. The system worked like this. A Jewish family facing persecution in France could receive coded messages about safe routes to Spain. Sympathetic merchants along the way would offer shelter, food, and information about which towns to avoid. Specific symbols, a lamp in a window, a mark on a doorpost, certain phrases in conversation signaled safe houses. It was an underground railroad before that term existed, except built not for escaped slaves, but for refugees fleeing religious violence. Muslim communities in Spain and North Africa maintained similar networks. When Christian kingdoms pushed south during the Reconquista, Muslims who refused conversion needed escape routes. According to Andalusian chronicles, entire families disappeared from Christian territories, only to resurface months later in Muslim-controlled regions, suggesting organized transit systems that operated quietly and efficiently. These networks weren't plotting the downfall of Christianity. They were coordinating survival. Information flowed between communities. Which kings were tolerant? Which bishops were dangerous? Which towns had recently expelled Jews? And where new pogroms were starting? This communication network saved countless lives by giving people a warning before violence erupted. Of course, Christians interpreted this organization as proof of a conspiracy. If Jews could coordinate across kingdoms, they must be plotting something sinister. If Muslims maintained trans-Mediterranean contacts, clearly they were spying for Islamic armies. The logic was peak medieval. People helping each other survive must be planning something evil. The irony is painful. Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells during the Black Death, a complete fabrication that led to massacres. But while being murdered for imaginary crimes, they were actually maintaining real networks to help families escape those very massacres. The conspiracy Christians feared, coordinated malevolence, never existed. The conspiracy they should have noticed, organized humanitarian aid across borders, was happening right under their noses. According to Geneza documents, a collection of medieval Jewish texts found in Cairo, Jewish merchants maintained extensive correspondence networks across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. These letters discussed trade, family matters, and, critically, safe travel routes and warnings about persecution. One merchant might write to his cousin in Tunisia, "Avoid the Rhineland this year. Difficult conditions," which was code for pogroms are happening, and you'll be killed. Muslim scholars maintained similar information networks. Libraries in Cordoba, Cairo, and Baghdad exchanged manuscripts, letters, and news. When Christian forces captured Muslim territories, scholars often fled with advanced warning, carrying books and knowledge to safer regions. This wasn't espionage. It was academic preservation, though Christian authorities viewed any Muslim coordination as threatening. The most remarkable aspect is how effective these networks were, despite medieval communication limitations. No telegraphs, no phones, no internet, just handwritten letters, trusted messengers, and oral traditions passed between communities. Yet information traveled surprisingly fast. A pogrom in Germany might be known in Spanish Jewish communities within weeks, giving families time to prepare or relocate. Ironically, these survival networks laid the groundwork for important historical developments. The communication systems Jewish merchants built for safety also facilitated trade, spreading goods and ideas across Europe more efficiently than many official channels. Muslim scholarly networks preserved classical knowledge that would later fuel the Renaissance, when Christian Europe rediscovered texts that Muslim libraries had protected. So yes, the conspiracy was real. Medieval Europe did have secret networks of religious minorities coordinating across kingdoms, sharing information, and helping each other survive. But instead of plotting evil, they were practicing something revolutionary for the Middle Ages: organized compassion. In a world that saw them as enemies, they saw each other as human beings worth saving. The Christians were right that the networks existed. They were catastrophically wrong about why. And that fundamental misunderstanding, seeing survival mechanisms as threats, seeing mutual aid as a conspiracy, led to atrocities that stain medieval history. The real conspiracy was that these communities had to operate in secret just to stay alive. Logistics of Alexander's campaigns. Let's dive into this, because when people imagine Alexander the Great, they picture the glory: charging cavalry, clashing shields, dramatic speeches before battles. But here's what nobody talks about: the unglamorous, essential logistical miracle that made any of that possible. Alexander didn't conquer half the known world because he gave inspiring speeches. He conquered it because every single soldier in his army ate breakfast. Think about that for a moment. Alexander marched roughly 40,000 men across deserts, mountains, and hostile territory for over a decade. That's 40,000 people who needed food, water, shelter, weapons, medical care, and motivation every single day. No supply helicopters, no GPS, no MREs or radio communications. Just an army that had to function like a moving city while simultaneously fighting the Persian Empire, the most powerful force on Earth. According to military historians like Donald Ingalls, This logistical achievement remains more impressive than Alexander's tactical victories. Battles are dramatic, yes, but logistics? Logistics is what separates a successful campaign from 40,000 corpses scattered across Asia. Here's where it gets interesting. Alexander inherited a brilliant system from his father, King Philip II of Macedon. Philip understood something most ancient commanders missed. Speed wins wars, but supply chains win campaigns. So he designed an army that traveled light, almost impossibly light for its size. Picture a typical ancient army. Soldiers carrying massive amounts of gear, servants hauling furniture for officers, wagons full of supplies, livestock, camp followers, the whole chaotic parade moving at the speed of the slowest ox cart. Philip looked at this mess and said, "No, absolutely not. We're running lean." Macedonian soldiers carried only essentials: weapons, armor, a cloak, a cooking pot, and a few days' worth of grain. That's it. No tents for regular infantry. They slept under the stars or in improvised shelters. No servants per soldier. Officers shared attendants. No excessive baggage. Every item had to justify its weight. The result? An army that could march 30 kilometers a day when other armies managed 15, which meant Alexander could arrive at battlefields before his enemies believed movement was possible. But stripping down the baggage train created a massive problem. How do you feed 40,000 men when they carry almost nothing? The answer was a supply system so sophisticated it would not look out of place in a modern military logistics manual. First, Alexander employed scouts, lots of them. These weren't just guys who rode ahead looking for enemies. They were intelligence specialists who mapped terrain, identified water sources, counted livestock in villages, checked grain stores, and evaluated whether regions could support an army's passage. According to Arrian, one of Alexander's primary biographers, scouts would ride days ahead of the main column, sometimes covering 50 kilometers in a single day to gather information. The reports these scouts sent back determined everything: the route, the pace, where to camp, whether to slow down to forage or speed up to reach a known supply depot. A wrong report could kill thousands through thirst or starvation. A good report saved the entire campaign. Second, Alexander negotiated extensively. Before the army arrived in a region, envoys rode ahead to arrange deals with local leaders. We need grain, fodder, and water. Provide it peacefully, and we'll pay fair prices and protect you from bandits. Refuse, and we'll take it anyway, but you won't enjoy the process. According to ancient sources, Alexander preferred cooperation over plunder, not because he was kind, but because destroyed villages can't supply the army next month. This diplomatic approach created something remarkable: voluntary supply chains. Towns across Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt opened their gates, not because they loved Alexander, but because he offered a better deal than resistance. He paid for grain, usually in silver. He protected trade routes. He punished his own soldiers who plundered without permission, which was revolutionary for ancient armies where looting was practically a salary. Third, and this is where the system gets genuinely impressive, Alexander synchronized foraging with military movement. When the army marched, units didn't just follow the road in a neat line. They spread out in a controlled pattern, with detachments sweeping the countryside for grain, fodder, and livestock. This wasn't random pillaging. It was an organized acquisition, planned by quartermasters who calculated exactly how much food the army needed. and where to find it. According to logistics specialists studying ancient military campaigns, Alexander's foraging operations resembled a harvesting machine moving across the landscape. Advanced units would identify resources, secure them, and coordinate with the main column, so supplies flowed continuously. It was agricultural warfare. Strip the land efficiently, but not destructively, because you might need to pass through again. But what about areas with no food? Deserts, mountains, barren regions where nothing grew? That's where Alexander's supply depots came in. Before major campaigns, his engineers established forward bases, fortified storage sites stocked with grain, dried meat, and fodder. These depots functioned like medieval gas stations, places where the army could refuel before pushing into hostile territory. The cavalry presented special challenges. War horses eat more than 10 soldiers combined. Alexander commanded thousands of cavalry, meaning his fodder requirements were astronomical. In grasslands, horses grazed. In barren regions, the army brought herds of livestock, creating a walking food supply. Sheep, goats, and cattle traveled with the army, eating the landscape and feeding soldiers as needed. It was slow, inefficient, and essential. Water was the ultimate constraint. According to surviving accounts, Alexander's route planning obsessed over water sources. Rivers, wells, oases, these determined where the army could go, regardless of tactical considerations. On forced marshes through arid regions, the army moved at dawn, stopped by noon to avoid heat exhaustion, and camped near water whenever possible. Scouts marked every spring, stream, and well days in advance, because a single miscalculation meant dehydration and death. Here's something that blows modern minds. Alexander's army had veterinarians, not just for horses, but for pack animals, mules, camels, oxen, every beast that carried supplies. Lose a pack animal and you lose the supplies it carried. According to military records, animal care was a constant priority, with specialists treating injuries, managing loads, and rotating animals to prevent exhaustion. The system wasn't perfect. Mistakes happened. Supplies ran short. Animals died. Soldiers went hungry. But the remarkable thing is how rarely this system completely failed. For over a decade, across thousands of kilometers, Alexander kept his army fed, equipped, and fighting. That's not luck. That's logistics functioning at a level most ancient armies never approached. So when you hear about Alexander's genius, remember, his greatest talent wasn't tactics. It was understood that battles are won with swords, but campaigns are won with bread. Every victory started with a calculation. How much grain do we have? How far can we march? Where's the next water source? And Alexander, more than any commander before him, made sure those calculations were correct. Because in the ancient world, an army without logistics wasn't an army. It was a mob waiting to starve. Now let's talk about terrain, because if logistics is the invisible battlefield, geography is the merciless opponent that never retreats. Alexander didn't just fight Persians, Indians, and rebellious satraps. He fought mountains, deserts, rivers, and weather, enemies that couldn't be defeated with courage or tactical brilliance. They could only be respected, prepared for, and occasionally outsmarted. Here's the thing about ancient military campaigns. Roads were terrible. Not needs repaving terrible, but barely exists and might actually be a goat path terrible. Roman roads, the famous stone highways that connected the empire, didn't exist yet in Alexander's time. He was marching through regions where road meant the direction travelers usually go when they not getting robbed. So every mile the army moved required planning that would make modern logistics officers weep with respect. According to historians studying Alexander's campaigns, his engineers and scouts evaluated every route for width, considering whether the baggage train fit. Grade: can loaded pack animals climb this? Surface: will rain turn this into impassable mud? And most critically, water access, because an army that can't drink doesn't march. It collapses. The Balkan campaigns early in Alexander's reign taught him brutal lessons about mountains. Narrow passes forced the army into vulnerable single-file columns. Ambushes could destroy units before reinforcements arrived. Cold weather made weapons brittle and soldiers dangerously slow. According to ancient accounts, Alexander lost more men to mountain terrain than to enemy action in several early campaigns. But he learned. By the time Alexander crossed into Asia, his mountain protocols were sophisticated. Advanced scouts marked safe paths. Engineers reinforced unstable sections. Pack animals were redistributed to prevent accidents, and the army carried extra rations specifically for high-altitude crossings where foraging was impossible. The Hindu Kush, crossing around 329 BCE, remains one of the most impressive logistical achievements in military history. This mountain range, with peaks over 4,000 meters, had destroyed armies before. But Alexander studied local knowledge, hired experienced guides, timed the crossing for the least dangerous season, and pre-positioned supplies at key points. The army suffered, absolutely. Cold claimed lives, altitude sickness weakened soldiers, and progress was agonizingly slow. But they made it through because Alexander treated terrain like an enemy that required intelligence gathering and strategic planning. Deserts were somehow worse. Mountains killed you slowly through exhaustion and cold. Deserts kill you quickly through heat and thirst. The Syrian steppe and later the Jedrosian desert taught Alexander that some environments don't care about military genius. They simply impose absolute limits on human survival. Crossing the desert required mathematical precision. According to ancient sources, Alexander's quartermasters calculated water consumption rates. How much does each soldier drink per day? How much do animals require? How far are water sources? Based on these calculations, they determined maximum march distances and planned rest stops around wells and oases. The intelligence network became critical. Local guides, captured scouts, nomadic traders, anyone who knew where water existed was interrogated, bribed, or hired. A single guide who knew a hidden spring could save thousands of lives. A guide who was wrong, intentionally or not, could doom the entire army. Alexander's solution to desert logistics was both clever and risky. He traveled light and moved fast. The army carried minimal supplies, marched during cooler hours, dawn and dusk, and pushed hard to reach known water sources. It was a gamble every time, racing dehydration and heat exhaustion against distance. When it worked, the army emerged stronger and faster than its enemies expected. When it failed, as it did catastrophically in the Jedrosian desert during the return from India, soldiers died by the hundreds. Rivers presented different challenges. The Granicus, Tigris, Euphrates, Indus, every major river was both obstacle and opportunity. Fording shallow rivers required tight formations to break the current. Deeper crossings demanded boats, rafts, or bridges. which meant Alexander's engineers were constantly working. According to engineering historians, Alexander's river-crossing techniques were remarkably innovative. His army used inflated animal skins as flotation devices, lashed logs together for makeshift rafts, seized local boats, and even built pontoon bridges when time allowed. The engineering corps traveled with tools, ropes, and specialists who could assess a river's depth, current, and crossing points. The psychological aspect mattered too. Crossing rivers made armies vulnerable, split between banks, struggling against the current, perfect targets for enemy attacks. So Alexander used deception. At the Hydaspes River, before facing King Porus, he marched troops up and down the bank for days, confusing Porus about where the crossing would happen. Then Alexander used a hidden island and a thunderstorm to launch a surprise night crossing, emerging on Pyrrhus' side before the Indian king could respond. Maritime logistics expanded dramatically once Alexander controlled coastal cities. According to naval historians, he didn't just capture ports. He integrated them into his supply system. Phoenician shipwrights built vessels for him. Cargo ships carried grain along coastlines, making coastal marshes far safer. River fleets in Mesopotamia and India became floating warehouses, keeping pace with the army and carrying tons of supplies. But storms remained uncontrollable. Ancient accounts record Alexander halting operations for days, waiting for seas to calm or rivers to drop from flood stage. He understood something crucial. Pushing through dangerous conditions destroyed armies faster than enemy resistance. Patience in the face of nature wasn't cowardice. It was tactical intelligence. Terrain also dictated battle choices. At Gaugamela, Alexander positioned his army on ground he'd personally inspected the night before, ensuring no hidden obstacles would disrupt his cavalry charges. At Issus, he forced a battle in a narrow coastal plain that negated Persia's numerical advantage. Geography wasn't just a factor in Alexander's strategy. It was often the primary consideration that shaped everything else. The lesson here is profound. Alexander conquered because he respected terrain. He didn't charge blindly into mountains, deserts, or rivers, believing courage would prevail. He studied, he planned, he prepared, and when nature said, "Not today," he waited. That restraint, that willingness to let geography dictate timing, separated Alexander from commanders who led brave armies to pointless deaths in hostile environments. Every great victory Alexander achieved started with a question not about enemy forces, but about the land itself. Can we march there? Can we survive there? Can we supply ourselves there? And before the swords ever clashed, those questions had to be answered correctly. Because in ancient warfare, the most dangerous enemy often wasn't the one holding a spear. It was the one holding all the water you desperately needed to drink. Let's talk about something ancient historians often skip over because it's not dramatic enough for epic poetry: medical logistics and morale maintenance. Alexander didn't just need soldiers who could fight. He needed soldiers who could walk, who stayed healthy enough to march 30 kilometers tomorrow, and who believed the campaign was worth the suffering. That required medical infrastructure and psychological management that most ancient commanders never even attempted. Here's the reality of ancient warfare. Disease killed more soldiers than combat. Dysentery, infections, fevers, parasites. Every army was essentially a mobile plague factory, cramming thousands of men together with questionable hygiene, contaminated water, and zero understanding of germ theory created perfect conditions for epidemics. According to military historians, typical ancient armies lost 10 to 20% of their strength to disease annually, which means over a 10-year campaign, you'd lose the entire army twice over, just from illness. Alexander's army didn't fall apart. Why? His medical logistics were shockingly sophisticated for the time. First, the army employed physicians, trained medical professionals who traveled with the baggage train. These weren't faith healers or guys who mumbled prayers and hoped for divine intervention. According to ancient sources, Alexander's doctors studied under the best medical schools in Greece, particularly the teachings of Hippocrates. They understood anatomy, they performed surgeries, they knew herbal treatments that actually worked, not just random plant mixtures that poison patients slightly less than the diseases. The medical staff carried tools, bronze scalpels, cautery irons for sealing wounds, forceps, bandages, herbal mixtures, and splints. After battles, they established mobile field hospitals where wounded soldiers received immediate care. This wasn't common practice in ancient warfare. Most armies let wounded soldiers bleed out or left them to die if they couldn't walk. Alexander's policy was revolutionary. Wounded soldiers were treated, evacuated if necessary, and given time to recover. But the real medical genius was preventive care. According to surviving accounts, Alexander's army took water safety seriously, extraordinarily seriously for the ancient world. Scouts tested water sources before soldiers drank. If water looked questionable, it was boiled, filtered through cloth, or mixed with wine, which has natural antibacterial properties. Modern analysis confirms this would have significantly reduced waterborne diseases, which were the #1 killer of ancient armies. In deserts, dehydration management became critical. Alexander reportedly established strict water discipline. Soldiers drank on schedule, not whenever they felt thirsty, because by the time they felt thirsty in extreme heat, they were already dangerously dehydrated. Officers monitored their units for heat exhaustion symptoms. Disorientation, weakness, and cessation of sweating, all signs that required immediate intervention. Here's a story that reveals Alexander's understanding of morale logistics. During a desert crossing, scouts found a small amount of water and brought it to Alexander in a helmet. The entire army was watching, exhausted and desperate. Alexander took the helmet, looked at the water, and then poured it onto the sand in front of everyone. His message was simple. I won't drink what you can't share. Was this theatrical? Absolutely. But it was also brilliant morale management. Soldiers who believe their commander suffers alongside them will march further, fight harder, and endure worse conditions. Alexander understood that morale was a resource that required constant maintenance, just like food and water. Speaking of morale, let's talk about something military historians call operational tempo management, which is a fancy way of saying you can't march soldiers into the ground and expect them to fight effectively. Alexander rotated units, giving exhausted troops rest while fresh units took the lead. During winter, he often paused major operations entirely, sheltering the army in cities or fertile valleys where food was abundant and soldiers could recover. These rest periods weren't just physical recovery. They were psychological resets. According to ancient sources, Alexander organized games, athletic competitions, theatrical performances, and religious ceremonies during these breaks. He distributed loot generously, held feasts, and publicly honored brave soldiers. This wasn't kindness. It was operational necessity. An army that believes it's winning, that sees its efforts rewarded, that feels valued by its commander, doesn't collapse from despair when the next hard march begins. The psychological aspect of long campaigns can't be overstated. Imagine being a Macedonian soldier. You've been away from home for 8 years. You've marched thousands of kilometers. You've seen half your unit die. And now Alexander wants to push deeper into India, where rumors say monsters live. Why would you continue? Because Alexander made you believe. He shared your hardships, he rewarded your success, and he made you feel part of something historic. But even Alexander's charisma had limits. At the Hyphasis River in India, his army finally said no. They'd reached their psychological breaking point. Homesickness, exhaustion, fear of the unknown, it all crashed down at once. Alexander argued, pleaded, even sulked in his tent for days. Nothing worked. The logistics of morale had finally failed, not because soldiers were cowards, but because human endurance, mental and emotional, has absolute limits. This brings us to communication and coordination, because maintaining morale required soldiers to understand what was happening and why. Alexander held regular councils with his officers, explaining strategies, discussing options, and letting commanders raise concerns. This wasn't democracy. Alexander made final decisions, but it was participatory enough that officers felt heard and could explain the plan to their troops. During marches, coordination happened through signals, horn blasts, drums, and shouted commands. Each part of the army, heavy infantry, cavalry, light troops, siege engineers, baggage train, knew its position and role. According to military historians, Alexander's army moved like a synchronized organism, adjusting formation, pace, and spacing with remarkable precision, considering they had no radios or written orders. Messengers were critical. Mounted couriers carried verbal or written orders across the army, sometimes riding dozens of kilometers to relay Alexander's commands to distant units. These weren't just random soldiers on horses. They were trained specialists who memorized complex instructions, navigated rough terrain at speed, and understood military terminology well enough to answer questions from officers who received the messages. Before major battles or movements, Alexander held war councils where he outlined objectives, explained terrain, and assigned specific roles. By the time the council ended, every senior officer understood the plan in detail. This was crucial because ancient battles were chaotic. Once fighting started, commanders lost direct control over most units. Victory depended on officers executing the plan independently when communication became impossible. The supply system also required constant communication. Scouts reported back on terrain and resources. Quartermasters coordinated with engineers about road improvements. Medical staff reported casualty numbers. Intelligence officers relayed information about enemy movements. All of this had to flow through communication channels that relied on messengers, written reports, and verbal briefings. According to historians studying ancient command structures, Alexander's army had remarkably efficient internal communication for its time. Information flowed up, down, and across the organizational hierarchy relatively quickly, allowing the army to adapt to changing situations faster than more rigid command structures. When scouts discovered a hidden water source, that information reached the relevant units within hours. When the engineers finished building a bridge, the main column received word to adjust its route immediately. But the most impressive communication achievement was external, Alexander's diplomatic network. He cultivated relationships with local rulers, sending envoys, making alliances, and establishing administrative systems in conquered territories. These weren't just political moves, they were logistical foundations. Friendly local governors maintained supply depots, provided intelligence, and kept conquered regions stable so Alexander's supply lines remained secure. Every piece of this system, medical care, morale management, communication, and coordination, worked together. Remove any one element, let disease ravage the army unchecked, let morale collapse, let communication break down, and the entire campaign would have failed. Alexander succeeded not because he was a tactical genius, though he was, but because he maintained every aspect of the logistical machine simultaneously over a decade of constant operations. The human cost was enormous. Soldiers died from disease, exhaustion, and combat. Families back in Macedon never saw their sons again. But the system held together long enough to conquer an empire, and that achievement, keeping 40,000 men functioning as an army for 10 years across hostile continents, remains one of the most impressive logistical performances in military history. Because at the end of the day, Alexander didn't just conquer Persia. He conquered distance, terrain, disease, hunger, thirst, and the basic human instinct to give up and go home. And he did it with Bronze Age technology. No engines, no electronics, just planning, discipline, and an obsessive attention to the unglamorous details that keep armies alive. That's the real genius. Not the battles, but the breakfast. Not the victories, but the water sources. Not the glory, but the grain shipments that kept arriving exactly when needed. Alexander understood something most conquerors never learned. Logistics wins wars. Everything else is just theater. All right, here's where things get real. Because no matter how brilliant your logistics are, no matter how perfectly you plan, eventually you hit the wall. And Alexander, after nearly a decade of military miracles, hit that wall hard in India. This is where we see the limits of even the most sophisticated ancient supply system, where nature, distance, and human exhaustion finally said, no more. Let's start with the monsoon, because nothing in Alexander's experience prepared him for this. Macedonians knew rain. They didn't know rain that falls continuously for months, turning roads into rivers, making storage impossible, and literally rotting grain before you could cook it. According to ancient historians like Arrian, the monsoon rains caught Alexander's army completely off guard. Picture this: you're a Macedonian quartermaster who successfully supplied an army across deserts and mountains. You've got systems, protocols, plans for every contingency. Then the sky opens up and doesn't stop. Roads you mapped last week are now knee-deep in mud. Supply carts sink until they're useless. Pack animals slip and break legs. Grain stores that were dry yesterday are moldy today. And the rain just keeps coming, day after day after day. The army's movement slowed to a crawl. What should have taken days took weeks. Foraging became nearly impossible because you couldn't see landmarks, couldn't navigate properly, and everything edible was either underwater or rotting. According to surviving accounts, soldiers developed infections from constant wetness. Their leather equipment fell apart, and morale plummeted because even making a fire became a technical challenge. But the weather was just part of the problem. The real issue was psychological collapse. These soldiers had been away from home for nearly 10 years. They'd marched across the known world, conquered the Persian Empire, and seen things no Macedonian had ever seen. And they were tired, not just physically, but emotionally exhausted in ways that no amount of rest could fix. The conspiracy theories started spreading through the ranks. Soldiers whispered that the edge of the world lay ahead, that monsters lived in the eastern forests, that if they kept marching, they'd fall off the earth into an endless void. These weren't stupid men. They were traumatized soldiers grasping for explanations for why their commander kept pushing deeper into unknown territory instead of taking them home. Then came the Hyphasis River in 326 BCE, the moment when logistics finally bowed to human limits. Alexander called his army together and announced they'd push further east. The response was silence, then murmuring, then open refusal. According to Arrian, soldiers stood their ground and said no. Not out of cowardice, Alexander's army had proven their courage in dozens of battles. They refused because they'd reached their breaking point. This wasn't a logistics failure in the traditional sense. The army still had supplies, still had weapons, still had the physical capacity to march. What failed was the human element that no supply system can replace, the will to continue. Homesickness, fear, exhaustion, loss of purpose. These aren't problems you solve with better grain shipments. Alexander tried everything. He argued that glory lay ahead. He sulked in his tent for days, hoping his absence would change minds. He made emotional appeals. Nothing worked. For the first time in his campaign, the logistics of the spirit failed. His soldiers had given everything, and they had nothing left to give. So Alexander turned back, but the logistical nightmare was far from over. The return route he chose, through the Gedrosian desert, became one of the greatest disasters in military history. And here's the brutal truth. This wasn't bad luck. It was a logistical gamble that failed catastrophically. According to ancient sources, Alexander chose the Gedrosian route partly for glory. No army had successfully crossed it, and partly to coordinate with his fleet supplying the army from the coast. The plan looked good on paper. March along the coast, receive supplies from ships, and emerge victorious on the other side. In reality, the desert was far more barren than scouts reported. The coast was too rocky for ships to land regularly, and wells that supposedly existed were either dry or fictional. The army entered the desert with inadequate supplies because Alexander believed resupply from ships would compensate. When the ships couldn't land as planned, disaster unfolded in slow motion. Water became scarce, then rare, then non-existent for stretches. According to Arrian, soldiers began dying not from enemy action but from thirst and heat exhaustion. The baggage train collapsed first. Pack animals, already weakened from years of campaigning and India's monsoons, couldn't handle the desert heat. They collapsed by the hundreds, and with them went the supplies they carried. Soldiers were forced to abandon equipment to lighten loads. The carefully maintained supply system that had worked for a decade simply disintegrated under conditions too extreme for any ancient logistics to overcome. Discipline started breaking down. Starving soldiers killed and ate animals needed for transport. Units became separated in the featureless landscape. Some men, delirious from dehydration, wandered off and were never seen again. According to ancient historians, the army lost more men crossing the Gedrosian desert than in all of Alexander's major battles combined. Even Alexander's leadership couldn't fix this. He shared his soldiers' suffering, refusing special treatment, but shared suffering doesn't create water where none exists. Officers tried maintaining order, but when men are dying of thirst, Rank matters less than survival. The famous story of Alexander pouring out water because he wouldn't drink what his men couldn't share? That happened here, and while it was inspiring, it didn't change the fundamental reality. They were in an environment that couldn't support 40,000 people, and no amount of leadership or logistics could alter that fact. The survivors who reached safety were traumatized, emaciated, and fundamentally changed. This wasn't the victorious army that had conquered Persia. This was a broken force that had confronted nature's absolute limits and barely survived. What does this disaster teach us about Alexander's logistics? Even the most sophisticated supply system has breaking points. The Gedrosian crossing failed because Alexander violated his own principles. He moved into hostile terrain without adequate reconnaissance, without confirmed supply sources, and without backup plans when the primary plan failed. It was the one campaign where his famous logistical caution abandoned him, replaced by overconfidence born from a decade of success. But even in failure, the system's remnants saved the army from total annihilation. Scouts still searched for water. Remaining supply ships dropped off what little they could when coastal access was possible. Officers maintained enough discipline to keep units together. Alexander's personal example prevented complete collapse. These fragments of the once perfect machine were barely enough, but they were enough. By the time the shattered army reached safety, the lesson was brutal and clear. Alexander had pushed logistics to its absolute limits and beyond. His campaigns proved that with brilliant planning, you could supply an army across continents. But they also proved that some environments simply cannot support large forces, no matter how clever the supply system. The empire's boundary wasn't drawn by enemy resistance. It was drawn by logistical reality, the distance from supply sources, the harshness of terrain, and the finite endurance of human bodies and spirits. Alexander could conquer armies, but he couldn't conquer geography, climate, and basic human needs for food, water, and rest. In the end, logistics wasn't just what made Alexander great. It was also what defined his limits. The supply system was a miracle of ancient engineering and planning, but miracles still obey physical laws. Push far enough, ignore enough warning signs, and even a genius fails. Alexander's campaigns remain the gold standard for ancient military logistics, but the Gedrosian disaster remains the cautionary tale. No supply system, no matter how brilliant, can overcome fundamental environmental impossibilities. Sometimes the answer isn't better planning. Sometimes the answer is acknowledging that certain places, certain distances, and certain conditions are beyond what human logistics can solve. And that knowledge, understanding where the possible ends and the impossible begins, might be the most important logistical lesson of all. The Subura district of Rome. Now let's talk about a place that makes every other neighborhood we've discussed look peaceful by comparison. If you wanted to find the real Rome, not the marble temples and triumphal arches, but the actual beating heart where ordinary people lived, worked, bled, and survived, you went to the Subura. And the moment you stepped into that district, you knew immediately you'd entered a different world. The Subura didn't welcome you gently. It hit you like a physical wall. First came the noise, overwhelming, relentless, the kind of sound that makes you understand why silence was a luxury reserved for the rich. Vendors screaming prices in Latin, Greek, Aramaic, and half a dozen dialects you couldn't identify. Children shrieking while chasing each other through alleys so narrow that adults had to turn sideways. blacksmiths hammering metal in open doorways, sending rhythmic clangs echoing off stone walls. Prostitutes calling from balconies, their voices cutting through the chaos with practiced precision. And somewhere, always, the sound of an argument escalating toward violence. Then came the smells, layered so thick you could practically taste them. Wood smoke from cooking fires mixes with the sharp tang of metalwork. Fish stew bubbling in clay pots, some fresh, some definitely not fresh. Spilled wine soaked into dirt streets that also function as sewers because Rome's famous sanitation system stopped at the Subura's borders. Sweat from laborers who bathed maybe once a month if they were lucky. And underneath everything, the distinctive smell of too many humans crammed into too little space, with inadequate hygiene and zero city planning. According to archaeological evidence and contemporary Roman sources, the Subura was essentially a vertical slum compressed into a few city blocks just northeast of the Forum. You could literally walk from Rome's most prestigious government buildings into complete chaos in under 5 minutes. The contrast was so extreme that ancient writers described it like crossing into a foreign country, which in many ways it was. The buildings themselves were terrifying architectural nightmares called insulae, tenement blocks that rose 5, 6, sometimes 7 stories high. These weren't built with care or safety in mind. They were investments built as cheaply as possible by landlords who wanted maximum rent from minimum expense. According to building codes that were routinely ignored, insulae leaned at alarming angles, swayed in strong winds, and had a nasty habit of collapsing or catching fire, sometimes both simultaneously. Picture living in one of these structures. You enter through a ground floor shop or tavern that never closes, meaning noise never stops. You climb narrow staircases barely wide enough for one person, steep and uneven, lit by whatever oil lamp you carried, because the landlord certainly wasn't providing lighting. Each step risks a broken ankle because the wood is rotted. The stone is cracked, or someone spilled something slippery that nobody cleaned up. You finally reach your apartment, though calling it that is generous. It's one room, maybe 10 feet square, for your entire family. No kitchen, just a small brazier that fills the room with smoke and represents a constant fire hazard. No running water, you haul buckets up those terrible stairs multiple times daily. No private toilet, you use a chamber pot or public latrine blocks away. Furniture consists of whatever you can afford. A straw mattress, a wooden stool, maybe a clay pot for cooking. That's it. That's home. The walls are so thin you hear every conversation, every argument, every intimate moment happening in adjacent apartments. Privacy is a concept that exists only for wealthy Romans living in their spacious domus houses on the other side of town. In the Subura, everyone knows everyone else's business because the architecture makes secrets physically impossible. Now multiply this by thousands. Entire families stacked vertically, immigrants from every corner of the empire, freed slaves trying to build new lives, laborers working dawn to dusk, prostitutes, thieves, merchants, craftsmen, all compressed into these creaking towers. The insulae were powder kegs of humanity, and they exploded regularly. Fires were the constant terror. According to Roman historians like Tacitus and Suetonius, fires in the Subura happened so frequently that locals barely reacted to small blazes. A single overturned oil lamp could ignite an entire building in minutes. The cheap wood and plaster construction went up like kindling. Smoke-filled narrow staircases, trapping residents on upper floors. Neighbors frantically hauled water in buckets, which was like fighting a forest fire with a squirt gun. The city had no organized firefighters for most of Rome's history. Private fire brigades existed, run by wealthy men like Crassus, who would show up at burning buildings and offer to buy the property at disaster prices while it was actively burning. Only if the owner agreed would Crassus's men actually fight the fire. If not, they'd watch it burn while negotiating. It's the most Roman thing imaginable, turning disaster into a business opportunity while people screamed from upper windows. Even when Augustus later created the Vigils, an official firefighting force, they struggled in the Subura. The streets were too narrow for equipment. Water access was limited, and the buildings were so poorly constructed that sometimes the best strategy was letting them burn completely and rebuilding. But fires weren't the only disaster. Collapses happened regularly according to contemporary accounts. A building would groan, crack, and suddenly dozens of people were buried under rubble. Sometimes the collapse happened at night, killing entire families in their sleep. Other times during the day, crushing shopkeepers and customers. Landlords would shrug, pay minimal compensation if any, and immediately start rebuilding to collect rent again. The residents adapted with grim pragmatism. You learned which buildings swayed too much in the wind. You memorized which staircases were most dangerous. You listened for creaking sounds that meant structural problems. You kept your most valuable possessions, which weren't much, near the door for quick evacuation. Living in the Subura meant accepting that your home might kill you, and there was nothing you could do about it except hope today wasn't the day. And yet, despite the danger, the overcrowding, the noise, and the smell, people survived here. Generations of families grew up in these vertical slums. Children learned to navigate the maze-like streets. Adults built communities, networks of neighbors who shared food during hard times, watched each other's children, and helped dig through rubble when buildings collapsed. The Subura wasn't just Rome's slum. It was Rome's engine room, where the empire's laborers lived. Every magnificent temple, every marble monument, every aqueduct that wealthy Romans bragged about, built by men who went home to the Subura's collapsing insulae. Every legion that marched across the empire, recruited from neighborhoods like this. Every merchant ship that docked in Ostia, unloaded by porters who climbed 6 flights of rickety stairs to their rooms every night. According to demographic historians, probably a quarter of Rome's population lived in or near the Subura. That's tens of thousands of people crammed into a district that covered maybe a few hundred acres. The population density was comparable to modern slums, except with Bronze Age sanitation and zero building codes. And this was normal. Not exceptional, not unusual, but standard housing for Rome's working class. The marble Rome of tourist imagination existed alongside this vertical poverty, separated by a 10-minute walk and an economic gulf wider than the Mediterranean. Senators in their comfortable homes could ignore it most days, but they knew the Subura was there, buzzing with noise, reeking of humanity, always one disaster away from chaos. This was the reality behind the glory, the foundation underneath the triumph. The place where Rome's working poor didn't just survive, but somehow built lives, raised families, and kept the empire functioning through sheer resilience. Because here's the truth that ancient historians often glossed over. Rome didn't run on marble and military glory. It ran on the labor of people who lived in the Subura, who woke before dawn, worked until dark, climbed those terrible stairs, ate whatever cheap food was available, and somehow found the energy to do it all again tomorrow. The Subura was dangerous, dirty, overcrowded, and constantly on the edge of disaster. But it was also undeniably, unmistakably, authentically alive in ways the Forum never was. This was where Rome breathed, sweated, argued, loved, and survived. This was the real empire, stripped of propaganda and marble facades. And if you wanted to understand how Rome actually worked, you had to understand the Subura, because no empire stands without a foundation. And Rome's foundation was built on neighborhoods like this, stacked vertically, held together by poverty and resilience, collapsing and rebuilding over and over again. Let's talk about the temples of the Subura, except these temples weren't built of marble or dedicated to Jupiter. They were taverns, the true gathering places where the district's soul lived. And if you think medieval taverns were rough, Roman taverns in the Subura operated on an entirely different level of chaos. These places were open from dawn until, well, they never actually closed. There was no last call in the Subura. The wine kept flowing, the conversations kept escalating, and trouble kept brewing 24 hours a day. Walking into a Subura tavern meant entering controlled chaos. The air inside was thick enough to chew, smoke from oil lamps mixed with steam rising from cooking pots, and the accumulated body heat of dozens of people crammed shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches. According to archaeological evidence from Pompeii and Ostia, which preserved similar establishments, these weren't spacious establishments with separate rooms. They were single rooms, maybe 20 feet square, packed beyond any modern fire code's worst nightmares. The wine flowed constantly, cheap, watered down, and served in endless clay cups that were reused until they cracked. According to Roman writers like Martial and Juvenal, Subura wine was notorious for being more water than wine, with suspicious additives to give it color and prevent spoilage. But it was cheap, which was the only quality that mattered to laborers who just finished 12 hours hauling bricks or unloading cargo ships. For those who knew the right people and had extra coins, stronger stuff was available under the counter. Imported wines from Gaul or the Greek islands, smuggled to avoid taxes. These weren't displayed openly because Rome had strict regulations about wine quality and taxation that everyone ignored while pretending to follow. The food was even more practical than the wine. Nobody came here for gourmet dining. You came for calories that kept you standing until tomorrow. Bread dipped in garlic oil and olive paste. The bowls of lentil stew that had been simmering for so long the original ingredients were a mystery. Sausages grilling on iron pans made from meat you absolutely didn't ask about. Fried fish from the Tiber, which, yes, was the same river the Romans used as a sewer, but frying kills most things, probably. According to price lists preserved from taverns across the Roman world, a meal in the Subura cost maybe 1 or 2 asses, the smallest bronze coins. That bought you enough food to quiet your stomach and enough wine to forget why your back hurt from carrying stones all day. The tavern owners knew their clientele perfectly, people who needed affordable fuel to survive, not culinary experiences to remember. But taverns weren't just places to eat and drink. They were the Subura's social infrastructure, where everything important happened that didn't involve an official building. According to ancient sources, business deals were negotiated over wine cups. Job offers were made and accepted on tavern benches. Marriages were arranged, usually informally, between families who'd been neighbors for generations. And most importantly, information flowed faster here than anywhere else in Rome. Gossip in the Suburra was currency. Who was hiring laborers? Which politician had embarrassed himself? What ship just arrived from Egypt carrying grain? Who won yesterday's gladiator matches? Who was sleeping with whom, which was always popular? If something happened anywhere in Rome, the Suburra taverns knew about it within hours, often before official channels reported it. The physical setup was designed for socializing and surveillance. According to archaeological evidence, taverns had counters along one wall where food was prepared and served. Some had outdoor seating areas, really just benches in the street, where customers could drink while watching the constant chaos of Suburra life. Posts were driven into counters, specifically for chaining drunk troublemakers who got too aggressive, a practical solution when fights broke out hourly. And fights did break out, constantly. Not always serious, but frequent enough that tavern owners kept bodyguards near entrances. These weren't trained security professionals. They were large men who understood that violence was part of the job description. According to Roman legal records, tavern brawls were so common that minor fights didn't even get reported unless someone died or the furniture was destroyed. The causes of fights varied wildly. Someone cheated at dice games that happened in every corner. Someone insulted someone else's hometown, a serious offense when your city's identity was your primary source of pride. Someone tried stealing from another customer's purse. Or someone just had too much wine and decided today was the day to settle that grudge from 3 weeks ago when Marcus looked at him wrong. But here's what's fascinating. The fights followed unwritten rules. Tavern owners tolerated violence up to a point. Fists were acceptable. Broken furniture got you thrown out, and knives were absolutely banned. According to legal sources, customers caught with concealed weapons could be barred permanently, which in the Suburra was a genuine social punishment, because taverns were essential community spaces. When fights erupted, the crowd would part, give the combatants space, place bets on the outcome, because Romans bet on everything, and then resume conversations once someone was unconscious or bleeding enough to concede. If both parties were still standing and conscious after a few minutes, someone would buy wine to restore peace. This was accepted protocol. You fought, you bled a little, you bought drinks, and life continued. Prostitutes worked the taverns openly, which surprised nobody because prostitution was legal and taxed in Rome. According to both archaeological evidence and literary sources, sex workers drifted between tables, offering conversation, company, or more, depending on negotiation and price. Some taverns had small back rooms that served dual purposes, storage and temporary privacy. Others had arrangements with nearby brothels. You bought drinks here, conducted business there. The tavern owners were their own unique class. According to Roman writers, they were usually freed slaves or immigrants who'd accumulated enough capital to buy or lease a space. They knew everyone, remembered everything, and maintained delicate balances between customers, local gang leaders, and city authorities. A good tavern owner knew when to water down wine further to prevent fights, when to offer credit to regulars facing hard times, and when to politely suggest that certain customers take their argument outside before furniture started breaking. These weren't just business people. They were community anchors, unofficial therapists, news broadcasters, and occasionally character witnesses when customers ended up in legal trouble. According to trial records, Tavern owners were sometimes called to testify about a person's character or whereabouts, which tells you how central these establishments were to daily life. At night, and remember, taverns never actually closed, the atmosphere intensified. Day workers stumbled in after sunset, exhausted and desperate for wine. Night workers, thieves, prostitutes, people whose jobs happened after dark, took over tables. Musicians sometimes appeared, playing flutes or drums for a few coins tossed into clay bowls. The noise level increased as exhaustion and alcohol removed whatever social filters people maintained during daylight. According to Roman poets who occasionally slummed in the Subura for material, the experience was overwhelming. Senses bombarded from every direction. Conversations in multiple languages overlap. Laughter mixed with arguments. The clatter of cups, the sizzle of cooking meat, and the occasional crash when someone fell off a bench or threw something at someone else. And yet, despite the chaos, these taverns were where the Sabores community existed. People who'd worked alongside each other for years gathered here nightly. Families celebrated marriages and mourned deaths over shared wine. Workers fresh from the provinces found their first connections to Roman life on these benches. Prostitutes and laborers, freed slaves and struggling merchants, they all mixed in spaces that wealthy Romans would never enter voluntarily. The Subura's taverns weren't tourist attractions or historical landmarks. They were survival infrastructure, places where Rome's working class found food, information, community, and temporary escape from lives that were brutal, short, and unrelenting. These smoky, crowded, slightly dangerous rooms were where the real empire lived, where ordinary people made the connections and found the support that kept them functioning. Because in the Subura, you couldn't survive alone. The work was too hard, the living conditions too dangerous, the system too rigged against you. So you found your people in the taverns. You shared wine that was more water than wine. You ate food that kept you standing, but wouldn't win culinary awards. You gossiped, you argued, you occasionally threw punches. And then you went home to your crumbling insula, climbed those terrible stairs, and prepared to do it all again tomorrow. The taverns made that bearable. They made the Subura livable. And in doing so, they kept Rome itself functioning, one cheap wine cup at a time. All right, here's where we need to talk about the Subura after dark, because if the district was chaotic during daylight, nighttime was when it truly revealed its teeth. Once the sun set behind Rome's hills, the Subura didn't quiet down or become peaceful. It transformed into something sharper, faster, and considerably more dangerous. This was when the district's other economy, the one nobody officially acknowledged, came fully alive. Let's talk about crime, because in the Subura, crime wasn't lurking in shadows or hiding from authorities. It walked openly, conducted business in plain sight, and operated with an efficiency that would impress modern organized crime syndicates. According to Roman historians like Suetonius and legal records from the period, the Subura was so notorious for theft that losing your purse here wasn't considered bad luck. It was considered inevitable if you weren't paying attention. Pickpockets worked the crowds like artists. These weren't amateurs fumbling with coin purses. According to descriptions from Roman writers, Subura thieves had the profession refined to a science. Children, often as young as 6 or 7, learned the trade before they learned to read. They'd move through market crowds, taverns, or anywhere people gathered, using techniques that wouldn't look out of place in a modern pickpocketing manual. The distraction method was most common. One kid would stage a dramatic fall or start a loud argument while a partner slipped hands into bags, cut purse strings with small knives, or simply lifted items from distracted merchants' stalls. According to Roman legal codes, getting caught meant brutal punishment, flogging or worse. But the risk-reward calculation made sense when your alternative was starvation. The smarter thieves didn't work alone. They belonged to organized groups, not quite gangs in the modern sense, but loose collectives that controlled territories, settled disputes, and punished members who violated professional codes. According to both literary sources and archaeological evidence, these groups had their own hierarchies, territories, and enforcement mechanisms. Gangs in the Subura varied wildly in size and purpose. Some controlled specific streets or insulae, collecting protection money from shopkeepers and tavern owners. The arrangement was simple. Pay us, and we make sure other criminals don't bother you. Refuse, and well, accidents happen. Shops get robbed, stock mysteriously catches fire, and customers get harassed until they go elsewhere. According to merchant records and legal complaints that occasionally reached Roman courts, this system was pervasive enough that most businesses just paid and considered it a cost of operating in the Subura. Other gangs specialized in specific crimes. Burglary gangs moved across rooftops at night, the insulae's poor construction making breaking into upper-floor apartments surprisingly easy. Cut a weak shutter, climb through a window, grab whatever had value, and vanish across the rooftops before residents even woke up. According to archaeological studies of insulae construction, security was essentially non-existent for most residents. If you had something valuable, you slept with it or accepted that it would eventually be stolen. Then there were the violent gangs, groups that controlled gambling dens, managed prostitution, and settled disputes with clubs, knives, and intimidation. These weren't large organizations with hundreds of members. According to what historians can piece together from fragmentary sources, most Subura gangs numbered maybe 10 to 30 members, enough to control a few blocks but not so large they attracted serious attention from authorities. The gang dynamics created a strange sort of order within the chaos. Territories were respected, mostly, because gang wars were bad for business. If two groups started fighting openly, it attracted the urban cohorts, Rome's police force, who would crack down on everyone involved. Better to maintain an uneasy peace through negotiation, bribery, and occasional targeted violence that didn't spill into the streets. According to Roman satirists who wrote about Subura life, some gangs actually functioned as unofficial neighborhood protectors. They kept rival gangs out, mediated disputes between residents, and occasionally helped during emergencies like fires or building collapses. It wasn't altruism, it was business sense. If your territory collapsed into complete chaos, you couldn't extract money from it. Better to maintain enough order that legitimate businesses could operate and provide income. But make no mistake, these were criminals, not community organizers playing at charity. According to legal records, violence was common, sometimes over territory, sometimes over insults, sometimes just because someone was drunk and felt disrespected. Subura residents learned to recognize gang members, know which groups controlled which streets, and avoid conflicts that could get them beaten or killed. The relationship between criminals and residents was complicated. According to both literary sources and inscriptions, many gang members were locals, People who'd grown up in the Subura and chosen crime because legitimate work paid starvation wages. Your neighbor might be a thief. The guy selling fish might run a gambling operation in his back room, and the woman who watches your children might also be fencing stolen goods. Everyone knew, nobody officially acknowledged it, and life continued. Rome's official security forces, the urban cohorts, had a fraught relationship with the Subura. According to military historians, these weren't trained investigators or community police. They were essentially soldiers tasked with maintaining order in an urban environment they barely understood, and they avoided the Subura whenever possible. Why? Several practical reasons. First, the terrain favored locals. The narrow, twisting streets, the interconnected rooftops, the countless hiding places and insulae, all of it made pursuing criminals nearly impossible for outsiders. A thief could vanish into a building and emerge 3 blocks away through rooftop passages that only residents knew existed. According to descriptions from Roman writers, chasing someone through the Subura was like hunting a ghost. They were there, and then they weren't. Second, the residents didn't cooperate. If urban cohorts entered asking questions about a crime, they encountered a wall of silence. Nobody saw anything. Nobody heard anything. Everyone was very busy with legitimate business and couldn't possibly help. This wasn't loyalty to criminals. It was survival instinct. Talking to authorities got you labeled a snitch, which in the Subura could get you killed. Better to stay quiet and let the system work itself out. Third, even when authorities made arrests, the legal system struggled with Subura cases. Witnesses refused to testify. Evidence mysteriously disappeared, and gangs sometimes bribed or intimidated officials to drop charges. According to legal historians studying Roman criminal justice, prosecutions for Subura crimes had low success rates, unless the victim was wealthy or politically connected enough to force the system to work. So the urban cohorts developed a practical policy. They responded to major incidents, murders, large riots, and building collapses with casualties, but ignored most everyday crime. Pickpocketing, not worth the effort. Minor assaults, let them sort it out themselves. Prostitution, legal and taxed, so not their problem. Gang activity, only if it spilled into respectable districts where rich people might get bothered. This created a fascinating dynamic where the Subura essentially policed itself through gang hierarchies, neighborhood networks, and informal justice systems. According to both literary sources and legal records, residents settled most disputes without involving authorities. If someone stole from a neighbor, other neighbors might recover the items and beat the thief themselves. If a gang member violated codes, his own group handled punishment internally. Information was the real currency of Subura crime. According to descriptions from Roman satirists and historians, criminals traded intelligence constantly. Who was carrying money? Who just received payment? Which shops had valuable inventory? Which buildings had easy access? Which officials could be bribed? This information network functioned faster and more efficiently than official channels. And it wasn't just criminals gathering information. According to ancient sources, prostitutes listened to clients and passed valuable gossip to gang leaders. Tavern owners heard everything and traded information for protection or profit. Even beggars served as lookouts and messengers, creating an invisible intelligence network that covered every street. The relationship between crime and legitimate business was equally blurred. According to merchant records and legal documents, Many supposedly legitimate enterprises had criminal connections. A butcher might buy stolen meat at discount prices. A tavern owner might store stolen goods in his back room. A landlord might rent rooms to known criminals without asking questions, because rent was rent. Everyone participated in the gray economy to some degree, because absolute adherence to law wasn't possible in a place where survival required flexibility. Here's what makes the Subura's criminal ecosystem fascinating from a historical perspective. It was stable. Not peaceful, not ethical, but remarkably stable. The gangs, the thieves, the violence, all of it existed in a kind of equilibrium that lasted for centuries. Rome's authorities tolerated it because eliminating Subura crime would have required resources they didn't have and might have destabilized the entire district, which would threaten the city's labor supply. According to administrative records, Roman officials essentially accepted the Subura as a necessary evil. Yes, crime happened there constantly. Yes, it was dangerous and disorderly. But it was also where tens of thousands of workers lived. The people who built Rome's monuments, unloaded its cargo ships, and formed the backbone of its economy. Crack down too hard and those workers might leave, riot, or simply stop functioning. Better to let the Subura regulate itself through its internal criminal ecosystem than risk destroying the whole delicate balance. So crime in the Subura wasn't an aberration or a failure of Roman law enforcement. It was a feature of the system, a shadow economy that existed parallel to the legitimate one, sometimes overlapping, sometimes competing, but always present. Thieves and gang leaders weren't outsiders attacking civilization. They were part of the district's social structure, as essential to its functioning as tavern owners or market vendors, just operating on the other side of legality. And every resident understood this. You learned to protect your belongings, avoid dangerous streets after dark, recognize gang members and show appropriate respect, and never, ever talk to authorities unless you wanted problems that would last longer than whatever crime you were reporting. In the Subura, justice wasn't about law. It was about understanding the rules that actually governed life in Rome's most notorious district. And those rules, written in blood, enforced by fear, and maintained through violence, kept the chaos just barely organized enough that the district functioned and Rome prospered. Because here's the final uncomfortable truth. Rome needed the Subura to be exactly what it was. Dangerous, criminal, chaotic, but functional. The empire ran on cheap labor, and cheap labor needed cheap housing, which meant insulae that collapsed regularly. Those workers needed entertainment and vices, which meant taverns and brothels operating constantly. And they needed a social structure that authorities didn't have to maintain themselves, which meant gangs providing the order that official law enforcement wouldn't. The Subura was Rome's shadow, the dark mirror that revealed what the empire actually was beneath the marble and the propaganda. And the crime that thrived there wasn't destroying Rome. It was, in its own twisted way, holding it together. The pleasure quarters of Kaifeng, China's floating world. Now, let's talk about something completely different, because we're leaving Rome's chaos behind and traveling east to Song Dynasty China, to a city called Kaifeng, where pleasure wasn't crude or violent, but refined into an art form so sophisticated it makes everything we've discussed so far look primitive. Welcome to China's floating world, the pleasure quarters that existed not as slums or criminal zones, but as sanctuaries of beauty, culture, and carefully orchestrated escape. Night in Kaifeng arrived differently than in the Subura. There was no explosion of noise and danger. Instead, evening descended like silk falling over the city, soft, deliberate, and impossibly elegant. As the sun slipped behind palace roofs and merchants closed their shutters, another world awakened, one built not on survival or violence, but on sensation, artistry, and the delicate promise that for a few hours the weight of ordinary life could be lifted. The transformation began with light. According to historical records from Song Dynasty chroniclers, servants emerged carrying lanterns and long chains, each flame protected behind lacquered shades of red, gold, and jade green. These weren't functional lights meant to prevent crime or guide travelers, though they did both. They were atmospheric, designed to transform ordinary streets into something dreamlike. Soon entire districts glowed like small constellations brought down to earth, shimmering above cobblestones, worn smooth by generations of wandering feet. Walking through the first archway into Kaifeng's pleasure quarters meant entering a space that operated on different rules than the rest of the city. According to accounts from contemporary visitors and later historical texts, the change was immediate and unmistakable. The clatter of daytime markets faded behind you, replaced by sounds that felt intentionally curated. The soft pluck of zithers, the rhythmic tapping of wooden blocks marking time, and laughter drifting through silk curtains, gentle enough that you couldn't tell if it was real or performed. The air itself changed. The smell of roasted barley tea replaced the harsh odors of street markets. Sandalwood incense burned in bronze holders, mixing with the faint sweetness of honeyed pastries and plum wine. According to historical descriptions, even the temperature felt different, as though the district existed in its own microclimate designed for comfort.